Intro. The 1920s, the decade right after World War One and right before, you know, Europe's healing, America's kind of going through a big bang, and a lot of modern stuff is starting to become a mainstream thing. It was also the time where there was a lot of prosperity in the US just because of the post war economy of it, which meant just exporting so much stuff from it. But we'll get to that later. Right now, all you need to know is the 1920s is a very important decade to actually look at because even though it's been more than 100 years since it started, it's still got some influence on our society to this day in one way or another. The 1920s saw a lot of good stuff come out of it in terms of entertainment. I mean, we just have genres of music like jazz because it was what was popping back in late A. It's something that brought a lot into the world just because it started the motions for what we know today. A lot of today's modern music comes from jazz in one way or another. It's like a skipping stone. The notable people for jazz are mainly like Louis Armstrong, since we all know him as a musician, and some others. At least most of us know who he is since it's been a while since he was at his peak popularity. But considering jazz has guitars and drums, mainly softer or maybe heavier ones depending on the song, it kind of makes sense that it would spawn these new music genres later on like rock. When we imagine the 1920s, we also have to imagine the state of music because it was much different than it was today. I know it's pretty redundant to say since it's common knowledge, but there was no Spotify or Apple Music back in late A. Digital music didn't exist, so people had to learn how to play a song if they wanted to, and they had enough dedication to it. Or better yet, watch someone else play the song they made. Pretty cool. Sounds like a good trade-off, right? That's basically what concerts are, so yeah, people still kind of prefer that one. But music was more rarer in the world we could use. It's more rarer. So music was a big thing back in the 1920s, and that's entertainment. But there's another type of entertainment that we can think of. Movies. Well, movies. Not the modern type we see today, but still, it's a start. They were mainly just silent films back then, since they didn't have all these cool things like IMAX or speakers. It was new technology back then, so they were really limited at first. Even if we look at the camera setup back then, it's massive. I doubt they would be able to fit any type of speaker in there, even if they tried. But what matters is it's a medium of storytelling that survived. That's all that matters, right? If it survived, we can talk about the quality of it later on, and how, if it's good or bad. But back then, it was like an event to go to the movie theater and see one of them, since they were kind of more rarer. Since movies were around a little bit before the decade, had some evolving technology, the very rare talkies can be found in the late 20s as new technology was invented around the mid 1920s. Now we have sound in our movies. Whoa. So that's pretty good. We have the entire MCU now because of that. So, which I mean shows how we've evolved in some ways with movies since then. Also related to Marvel, but not fully, we get to see movie stars for the first time. There were probably some famous people in movies before, but they weren't known for just being in movies. Now that's changed, with the first major one being Charlie Chaplin and whatever comedy movies he was in at the time. There were a lot of them. This also caused scandals, but that can be for a later time since they aren't too big now in the 20s. During the 1920s, there was a lot that happened throughout the world for the people who really didn't have the same rights as everyone else. For example, in the US, women weren't able to vote entering the decade. Luckily, the 19th Amendment made that possible, so strides for women. Also during this time, there were movements for civil rights and stuff, as there should be, since everyone is equal to everyone else. You're not harming anybody, so they shouldn't be discriminated against. Yet in the 1920s, a few things kinda happened for this to be put back a little. One of those being the, refounding of the Triple K, as we'll call it. It basically just was this extremely racist group. You probably know, but like the history of it. But I talked about how in the previous decade there was a revival of the group at Stone Mountain. They slowly crept up in some areas just due to the popularity of racism in some of those areas. This culminated in the racist sentiment in the South that's still kind of lingering there today. Not as much, but it is still there. Also during the decade, an American law was signed in, kind of two of them. An American law was signed in, kind of like the Australian one from 1901, but a little bit different. This one said that there will be quotas on countries that are in Western and Northern Europe. This was on purpose, by the way, since the law made was kind of just like that, and it was to protect American homogamy. These are basically the Aryan blood areas, if you didn't notice, which is why some politicians back then liked it, and some future ones also did as well. But like mentioned before, they signed two separate laws throughout the decade to make sure they stopped that immigration process. The first one in 1921, which made the quotas and put them at 3%. The second one in 1924, which made the quotas stricter at 2%. Basically just saying that the population could be more than this from a country. There's a way to calculate it. You would then be right if you thought this was wrong, because it is. But this also caused what people call illegal immigration, because this all immigration was fully legal before this, and it was really easy to get into the country from any country. That's why Ellis Island is an important part in many East Coastern news, like lives, or just their family heritage. It was one of the main hubs where people came into the country and found essentially what was a new home back then. They all had a chance. But in modern day, we can kind of still see that because of how much influence this decade had from one political party. In the U.S. at least, the 1920s was a decade of more conservative-leaning presidents, I would say, and I think other people would say. The decade was the first time in a while that there were more than two presidents in a decade, which is pretty cool. Which is also surprising. But in the 20s, there was also more isolationist mindset, which, not really good. That'll be mentioned more later, but you can see an isolationist mindset was the immigration laws that were passed during this time. It's just bound to happen with stuff like this. But other than those two things, there were positives, but also some negatives. So really just a mix when it comes to, rights and becoming equal and not, and all that. Technology, the thing we really love, popped off throughout the decade. Not in the digital way like today, but in how people consumed it. We love consumerism, and we love consuming products, said the public throughout the decade. Radios were one of the big things that boomed throughout the decade, since it was pretty cool for the time. Now you could listen to any song that was being played over these funky things called airwaves. And you can listen to it in your house. That's the future. How cool is the future? And you can pick between all these stations. Whoa, amazing. Please buy this, please. And you will, and you did. Now, there's at least one radio in your living room, maybe even more. You don't have to see things to know what they're like. That's the imagination part of the radio. That was pretty good for the time. But that's not the only thing, really, you need an imagination for. You need to imagine how this map will fit into your brain. Your brain now can get you from one place to another without having to do exercise. Whoa. Now you can buy a somewhat affordable car and drive. Drive until you feel like stopping or your car runs out of gas. But hey, it's faster than walking right now, and you can park it in front of wherever you live. Not many laws yet about them, so get in early while the trend is hot. It's going to stick because you could just take this over your trains or buses. This also goes well with the other stuff in your house now, like your fridge that you probably just got. just all of the common stuff everyone's buying. But now life's more different if you live at home, in your domestic life. You don't have to rely on old techniques or whatever witchcraft you used before. Now it's as easy as putting your stuff in the fridge. But then that means life is simpler. You have more time to do things. I can tell you one thing you will not be doing, and that's drinking. All because of this thing called Prohibition. We all know what Prohibition is, but for the people who do not, it basically boils down to Americans drinking so much, like a lot of alcohol, that people were like, please don't drink anymore, make a law against it. And so they did. Now it's illegal to sell alcohol in the US for the time being. But you may be wondering, isn't it hard to enforce? Yes, it is. It would be nearly impossible to enforce this, which is why black markets popped up known as speakeasies. Hello, kind lad. Do you want some alcohol, but it's illegal to drink? Why then? Come down to this password-encrypted bar. Just ignore the suspicious locations for these peculiar activities. It was essentially just that. You know, the thrill of what it's like to do something you shouldn't. The adrenaline you get and the rush. That's basically what speakeasies were all about back then. And that's what people used it for. A fun and thrilling ride where you can drink alcohol and all this stuff. And it's also now legal, so more fun if you're one of those lawbreaker types. Listen, buddy, it's the new trend. Also, whatever you do, don't bring anybody else to the speakeasies. This is for us. Nobody else is allowed. That's what the point of this weird place is for. We have stuff like for you, like in an exchange. You give us money and don't narc on us, buddy. We will know. You know what happens to snitches, right? If you don't, let's just say you don't want to learn. Anyways, let's get back into why these are important. They basically were secret bars, but we know that. But it made an underground scene very popular. Usually before this, everything would be on the street level where you could see it. But if you're walking down the street, you would be able to see it. And you don't want to see these, especially during Prohibition. But now that's changed. Where'd it go? You asked and you looked for your bar. Now it's underground. And you're just going to deal with it. Okay, buddy, that's what I thought. But now you can walk downstairs and see this cool thing that kind of has a longevity design to it. It's modern design. But this caused underground scenes and gangs in some cities to grow. It's harder to enforce laws, but that means it's easier to find workarounds for dodging them. Essentially, just dodge them. That's mainly what underground culture started as, and as we know, it kind of evolved just a little bit over time. Some of the examples we can see from this are things like concerts and modern bar aesthetics, like all that pizzazz. You get the idea. But you've probably seen a lot of stuff inspired by it, so that's really enough, really. You've probably been to one of them. Now, we get to move on to funny economics of the 20s. As mentioned before, the economy of the 20s depended on where you were. Now, in Europe, you funny lads experienced this thing called post-war economy, but not the good type of post-war economy usually, especially Germany. Buddy, you don't get that, not after the Treaty of Versailles. Enjoy buying your bread for 1 trillion marks. That's just how your life will be from now on. But why did this happen? Germany lost the war the most, even though they didn't even start it. They had a bunch of debt they had to pay to other people, so they printed more money. Money being printed decreases the value of it. That's simple economics. It's why deficits are bad for budgets, because it increases inflation rates for the currency that they're on. That can be explained later, but now let's focus on your 1 trillion mark bread. That's going to cause an uprising for you, so let's just hope you survive. Other countries in Europe, the other two big ones, the empires, the UK and France, who both had different economies, vastly different from Germany's, France had a good one and almost the best economy out of the three, and probably in Europe, just due to Reconstruction and stuff like that. Britain, on the other hand, was in between. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't good, since, instability kind of does that, and that's kind of the definition for it. Have you ever been drunk and you're about to fall? That's what economic instability is like. So now we have the graph to show that. The in-between. Now let's put a tariff on every country because we are better. Ignore what actually happens because that's not reality. That's not the reality I want. Tariffs are for the strong guys, not the weak. For sure. Francium. So what happened after the 1922 tariffs were introduced? A bunch of things actually in the US. Prices went up, that's for one. That's kind of a given for things that are region locked like coffee beans. It also made other countries put up their own retaliatory tariffs, which just means that more trade wars happen, but at least things are made in the US, right? Right, guys? Somewhat, but there's also the idea of overproduction. There's a lot of demand, so you make a surplus of products to match it and then have extra. Sure, it may cause prices to go down, but you have to keep that demand high for it to actually work. And plus, you still have extras. But if that demand drops, then everything drops in prices and the markets crash. So then what do? That's something for the next decade. Right now, we only have the current tariffs in the roaring 20s. That's what we need. No need to worry about the post-war economy because it's doing pretty good. Stock market's up. Everything's up for now. We only care about the now. Buy, sell when you're high. Even if most of the roaring is underground, it's still making more money for the economy. Money is money, and money is good. Except for when it's not there, which brings us to the start of the Great Depression. The thing we all know that started at the tail end of the decade. There's not much of it to talk about since most of it is the next one. But most of what happens is just the stock market crashing. That means a lot of people's money is now gone because banks at the time didn't have to guarantee people the money they put into the bank. It was just kind of like, I hope I get it. So what happened is a bunch of people that pulled out their money pulled out a lot of other people's monies as well. And all that, and the banks didn't have enough for everyone who wanted to get theirs. Sucks to suck, buddy, because money matters and is everything you own. The days of bartering are over, but what were some of the things that caused the Great Depression? A lot of them were things like the rapid rise in stocks in the economy. When you have too high of a GDP rise, high inflation usually goes along with it because there's too much money being released into the economy. In 1929, that's what happened. Too much money, and so to counter that inflation, interest rates are usually raised. Instead of steadily raising the interest rates, just point your arm up into the air. That's what it was basically like in 1929. So a drastic hit like that usually leads to people selling their stocks. When people panic, they sell. That's one of the ideas behind stocks. That's what happened, and some people won and some people lost. Those who won didn't really gain too much since the interest rates were still very high. So with this much money, would the system of not having too much government intervention still work like it did throughout the decade? That's for the next decade, but right now people need investments, not the companies or anything privatized. It's the public stuff that needs their interest, the government's interest. So in conclusion, the decade of the Roaring 20s had a lot of progress made, like most decades, but this time under the banner of Prohibition and extreme hype for stuff. So in general, there was a lot of good, but also some bad. But that's every decade. None of them are really perfect, but this is also the last decade for the progressive era, which is weird since it's either this or the 1910s usually. But with the conclusion of the Great Depression affecting everyone, and it looking like it might take a while to end, it looks like it may be a problem for the 1930s. But overall, that's about it. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Pretty please.